just a nurse," Dr. Caldwell said, watching her move through the trauma bay with the precision of someone accustomed to organized chaos. "That's all she'll ever be." He didn't know she'd spent 18 years rebuilding her life in Portland's fluorescent corridors, letting colleagues assume the quiet woman with the scarred forearms was simply compassionate, the type who took extra shifts without complaint and asked nothing in return. He didn't know that beneath her scrubs, sewn into the lining of her jacket, was a faded Special Forces unit patch she'd carried for 2 decades, touching it each morning before her shift began like some people touch crosses. He didn't know that the trembling in her left hand, the one colleagues mistook for nervousness, was muscle memory from a blast radius that had taken her right shoulder mobility and given her something worse, the inability to forget. Dead wrong about who was standing beside him. Hannah Clarke arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 6:13 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, the Portland rain hammering the parking lot like something trying to get her attention. She moved through the sliding doors, her shoes silent on the polished linoleum, water beading on her dark blue scrubs. The hospital smelled like every hospital smelled, antiseptic layered over something underneath it, something organic and persistent. Bleach. Coffee from the break room. Underneath that, the faint metallic scent of blood no amount of cleaning could completely erase. She kept her head down. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial started with a soft handoff at the nurses' station, 23 beds across 3 wings, 2 residents who'd graduated medical school in the last 7 years, and 1 attending physician who still believed nurses existed to fetch things. Hannah had worked here for 2 years, ever since relocating from San Diego, and in that time she'd developed an invisible armor of competence so complete that people stopped seeing her. They saw the efficiency. They didn't see the person. "Clarke, Trauma Bay," said Marcus, the charge nurse, without looking up from the assignment sheet. "Standard rotation. Starting with bed checks." "Copy," Hannah said. 1 syllable. 2 if absolutely necessary. It was easier that way. The trauma bay was empty at this hour, which meant there was space to think. Hannah moved through the bay with the kind of systematic awareness that came from 17 years of running casualty stations in places where your next breath depended on knowing exactly where every instrument was and how fast you could reach it. She reorganized the setup without being asked, the 4 kits grouped not by size but by access speed, trauma shears positioned where her right hand could grab them without shifting her weight, the monitor leads arranged in a pattern that made no sense to anyone who hadn't practiced emergency medicine in a tent outside forward operating base Shank. Dr. Caldwell passed the trauma bay entrance around 7:15 p.m., his expensive shoes clicking against the tile with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to the sound of his own presence announcing him. He wore a Rolex, expensive enough that it caught the fluorescent light, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man whose reputation had become his shield. Chief of surgery at Oregon's 3rd largest hospital for 11 years. No malpractice suits that had stuck. A wife who served on 3 charitable boards. A golf handicap of 6. He glanced at Hannah without really seeing her. What he saw was a woman maybe 45, maybe older, with the kind of posture that suggested someone had trained her to be smaller than she was. She wore her scrub sleeves rolled down past her wrists even in the warm trauma bay, unusual, something most nurses didn't do. Her dark hair was pulled into a braid that looked military precise, though he wouldn't have used that word. Her hands moved with a kind of economy that suggested she'd done this before, many times, but nothing in her file indicated anything beyond standard RN training. What he didn't see was the way she arranged those instruments like someone who'd arranged them under fire. The way her eyes tracked the room's exits and entry points. The way her breathing remained steady while handling items that made junior nurses nervous. The way she moved her left arm with a slight modification, favoring her right, a compensation so automatic she probably didn't notice it anymore. He continued walking. Hannah finished organizing and stepped into the break room around 8:02 p.m., the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like something mechanical and dying. She unwrapped a sandwich she'd made that morning, turkey, no mayo, exactly the way she'd been trained to eat when staying alert mattered more than taste. Sarah Chen, one of the day shift nurses, was sitting at the small table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting. "You have to tell me something," Sarah said without preamble. "Because it's driving me crazy." "Where are you from?" Hannah took a bite of her sandwich. Chewed. Swallowed. The question was casual, the kind colleagues asked, but something in it carried weight. Sarah had been watching her work, watching the precision, the way Hannah had once talked a resident through a difficult for placement with the patience of someone who'd taught worse things to people terrified and bleeding. California, Hannah said. Partial truth was easier than full truth. Spent some time there. Yeah, but before that. Because no offense, Clarke, but you move like someone who's been trained. Like military trained, not just nursing trained. Hannah pulled her scrub sleeves down, covering the network of scars that ran from her left wrist to somewhere above her elbow, the pale raised lines that caught light wrong. She'd been careful about this, never going sleeveless, never changing clothes around other staff, never giving anyone reason to ask direct questions. Just cautious, she said, and smiled the kind of smile that closed conversations. I like to know where everything is. Sarah accepted this because people generally accepted whatever explanation you offered if you delivered it with enough calm. Confidence was the currency of believability. Hannah had learned that long before medical school. She finished her sandwich alone and pulled her jacket from her locker at 9:15 p.m. The jacket was worn Cordra, nothing special, the kind of outdoor gear you could buy at any REI. She didn't take it off as a rule. Underneath the lining, hidden in a way that would require actual effort to find, was the unit patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Battalion, sewn there by someone who'd wanted her to remember. She touched it briefly, fingers pressing against the fabric from outside the jacket, a gesture so small and habitual that if anyone had been watching they might have thought she was checking her pockets. She hadn't examined the patch itself in maybe 4 months. She knew exactly what it looked like, the eagle, the digital camouflage colors faded now to something that looked like a ghost image of itself, the edges softened from being touched. She knew this the way people know rooms they used to live in, the way memory works when you're careful not to look directly at it. The shift moved into its rhythm. Hannah checked vitals on the sleeping patients, documented everything with precise notation, and stayed invisible. This was the skill she'd developed in 2 years at Oak Creek Memorial, the absolute perfection of being unremarkable. Competent enough that no one questioned her work. Quiet enough that no one asked follow-up questions. Present enough that she was useful. Absent enough that she was forgettable. At 10:06 p.m., her phone buzzed against the counter at the nurse's station. The message was from the Flight Operations Center. Standard alert, the kind that came through the hospital's notification system. Critical transport inbound. Military origin. ETA 12 minutes. Marja region, catastrophic hemorrhage, category C blood loss, patient stabilized to the extent possible in flight but condition unstable. Single occupant. Male. Mid-20s. Trauma team to assemble immediately. Hannah read it once. Read it again. Marja. Helmand Province. She knew Marja the way some people knew their hometowns, not fondly, but completely. Every street. Every building. The forward casualty station where she'd worked with 2 surgeons and a pharmacist who'd trained at Johns Hopkins. The inbound medevac route that they'd had to change 3 times because of mortar fire from the eastern ridge. She closed the notification and set her phone down with the kind of calm that comes from being trained for the moment when your entire world shifts sideways while everyone around you is still looking at monitors and charts. Marcus was already radiating instructions across the trauma bay. All hands. Incoming critical from Marja. Major hemorrhage. I need crash cart prepped, blood bank notified, 2 surgeons standing by. Clarke, get trauma 1 ready. Assume multiple transfusions. Hannah was already moving. She didn't have to be told twice. The muscle memory wasn't just physical, it was in her awareness, the way she knew exactly what would be needed because she'd needed it before, had administered it with hands that were steadier then, had made the same decisions under circumstances that made this moment look like a simulation. She organized the instruments. She arranged the blood warmer. She checked the suction line twice, muscle memory from a time when suction that failed meant watching someone drown in their own blood while you stood there unable to prevent it. The trembling in her left hand was barely visible now. She breathed through it like she always did, the way she'd learned to breathe through pain that was information, pain that was data, pain that meant you were still alive to feel it. The overhead intercom crackled at 10:59 p.m., exactly 10 minutes after the notification had arrived. Incoming trauma, 1 minute. Hannah stepped back from trauma bay 1 and waited, her hands positioned at her sides, her breathing steady, her mind already running through triage protocols that had been written into her nervous system 2 decades ago. She didn't know yet that the inbound patient would change everything. She didn't know that Dr. Caldwell was about to watch her work and realize, far too late, that he'd been standing next to someone he should have recognized the moment she walked into his hospital. She only knew that someone was hurt. Someone was coming. Someone needed her to be exactly what she'd been trained to be. The rotor wash shook the hospital's emergency entrance. The door slid open. And whatever her life had been before this moment, it was about to become something else entirely. The door slid open, and the stretcher rolled in with the kind of urgency that stops conversations mid-sentence. 12 minutes from Marja. Catastrophic bleeding. The Green Beret's uniform was dark with it, a color that told Hannah everything her eyes needed to confirm, arterial, massive, the kind of blood loss that measured time in minutes, not hours. She didn't think. Muscle memory took over. Typo negative, push it now. Her voice cut through the emergency bay like a scalpel. 3 nurses froze, looking for Dr. Caldwell, waiting for the hierarchy to establish itself. Hannah was already moving. I said now. Get me 2 units whole blood, 1 unit of fresh frozen plasma. 14-gauge angiocath in the left arm, establish a second line in the right femoral vein. The nurses moved. Not because of her title, she had no title, but because her hands were already unwrapping trauma shears, because her shoulders were squared like someone who had done this before, because her voice carried the weight of decisions made under fire. A floor nurse doesn't command like that. A floor nurse doesn't apply pressure points with the precision of someone who has watched men bleed out in Kandahar and learned exactly where to press to buy minutes. She worked through the night with her hands that had forgotten how to shake, maintaining his vitals as the blood loss numbers climbed and his oxygen saturation dipped and climbed again. 72. 81. 86. The numbers told a story her colleagues couldn't read. She was talking to him in the language of survival, in metrics and pressure and the kind of focus that comes from having stood in a medevac helicopter with a dying soldier in your arms. Around 3 in the morning, when the world outside the hospital had gone quiet and the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects in a jar, the operator's hand found her wrist. His eyes were still clouded, still caught somewhere between Marja and Portland, between this moment and whatever nightmare his brain was processing. Major. His voice barely made sound. Major, the school. Did the children? She held still. Didn't pull away. Didn't look at the other nurses who were suddenly very interested in their charts. The rubble, he whispered. There was a girl. Dark eyes. She was singing. I remember the singing. Hannah's jaw tightened, just barely. A muscle flickering beneath her skin. She maintained his flow without breaking rhythm, her hand steady as surgical lasers even as something inside her stopped moving. You pulled her out, he continued, words fragmenting like radio static. You had a scar. Here. His free hand tried to lift toward her face but the foreline held him. You said your name was Hannah. She didn't confirm. Didn't deny. She simply adjusted his sedation, and within seconds his eyes closed and his grip loosened. But her hand stayed on his wrist for exactly 8 more seconds before she released it, and when she stood up, only one of the 3 nurses still in the room was watching her. That nurse would tell the others. By morning shift change, everyone would know that Hannah had recognized something in the unconscious operator. That she'd moved like she knew him. That she'd stopped moving like a nurse and started moving like someone reclaiming something she'd buried. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 7:30 for morning rounds, and he saw immediately what had shifted in the room's gravitational field. When he entered, 2 senior nurses who normally deferred to him stepped aside for Hannah to present the patient's vitals first. One of them actually waited for her recommendation before adjusting the morphine drip. Another asked her permission before running the morning labs. Permission. From a nurse. From Hannah, who 2 days ago had been invisible. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They narrowed like a predator catching the scent of something that didn't belong in its territory. He watched her move through the patient's assessment, checking the chest tube placement, evaluating the dressing, predicting the next intervention before he could suggest it. Her hands moved with the kind of authority that you either earned in combat or spent a lifetime practicing, and Caldwell had spent enough time around medical professionals to recognize the difference. He stood at the foot of the bed, jaw clenched, watching Hannah explain the patient's status in clinical language so precise it sounded like testimony. Not a request for direction. A report from someone who understood the medicine at a depth most nurses never reached. By 7:45, Dr. Caldwell had made his decision. The overhead page came at 8:15, during shift change when the hallways were crowded and the word would travel fastest. Will Nurse Hannah Clarke please report to administration immediately? Nurse Hannah Clarke to administration. The intercom clicked off. The hallway didn't exactly go silent. Hallways in hospitals never go completely silent, but something shifted in the air pressure, the way it shifts before a storm. Hannah was restocking a medication cart, her hands moving with the same mechanical efficiency they always did, and she didn't pause. Didn't react. She simply set down the bottle of metoprolol, took one measured breath, and walked toward the elevator. Behind her, whispers started. Colleagues exchanged glances. The girl from post-surgical recovery who'd somehow commanded the trauma bay last night was being called to the carpet, and everyone could sense it. The administration office was all beige walls and the smell of printer toner. Hannah sat in an uncomfortable chair across from a woman named Patricia who worked in HR and clearly had no idea why she was facilitating this meeting. Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, the posture of a man used to being obeyed. There are concerns, he began, about your actions during the emergency admission yesterday. Hannah didn't say anything. Specifically, about scope of practice. You're a floor nurse, Ms. Clarke. You're not a physician. You're not a trauma surgeon. When Dr. Ellison arrived, he found you already deep into invasive procedures, establishing femoral lines, making clinical decisions that are outside your certification. Still nothing. Just her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on his face like she was reading subtitles. It's reckless behavior. It's dangerous. And it creates liability for this hospital. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to using authority like a bludgeon. One more instance of overstepping your scope of practice, and we will terminate your employment. Am I clear? Hannah nodded once, her composure so complete it seemed to agitate him further. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to defend herself or cry or show some recognition that he had power over her. Instead, she simply waited, and after 17 seconds of silence that felt like an accusation, Patricia cleared her throat and said Hannah was free to go. The supply closet ambush came at 2 that afternoon. Hannah was restocking gauze on the third shelf when the door closed behind her and Caldwell's presence filled the small space with the kind of intensity that makes air feel heavy. She didn't turn around. Just kept placing boxes. You're a problem, he said quietly. And I solve problems. Still nothing. Her hands continued their work. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed like it was annoyed by their conversation. That little performance in the trauma bay, that doesn't happen again. You listen to physicians. You follow orders. You remember that you're at the bottom of a hierarchy that exists for reasons. His voice dropped another register, the kind of tone that had probably broken residents and junior nurses for years. Scars don't impress me. Neither does whatever you did before you got here. This is my hospital, and you will follow my rules, or I will make sure you never work in medicine again. Hannah placed the final box on the shelf and turned to face him. His face was inches from hers. Close enough that she could see the vein pulsing in his temple, the calculation in his eyes, the moment he realized he'd miscalculated. She took one breath. "I've stood before better men than you," she said, her voice like a door closing, and watched them fall. "You don't frighten me." A tear escaped her left eye. Just one. Not from fear. From the exhaustion of 2 years of pretending to be less than she was, of standing in supply closets while people like Caldwell decided what she was allowed to be. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady, her gaze colder than anything he'd felt in a decade of wielding institutional power. He stepped back. Actually stepped back, because there are moments when a person looks at you and you realize you've made an enemy of something you didn't understand was in the room with you. "You're done on trauma rotation," he said finally. "Effective immediately. Post-surgical recovery. That's where you'll stay." Hannah nodded once, and when she walked past him out of the supply closet, her hands weren't shaking. It was the opposite of shaking. It was the calm that comes from finally stopping the thing you've been fighting against since the moment you put on scrubs. The parking lot at 6:47 in the morning still held the chill of night. Rain had just stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and gleaming under sodium lights. Hannah pushed through the employee entrance, her badge already clipped to her scrubs, moving through the thin air that comes before a shift change. She had 17 minutes before round started on post-op. Dr. Caldwell was waiting by the staff parking section. Not coincidentally. Not naturally positioned for a casual conversation. He stood with his arms crossed, his surgical jacket pristine despite the hour, and his presence made the air pressure change, suddenly heavier, deliberately placed in her path like a man positioning a chess piece. 3 nurses walking toward the building slowed their pace, sensing the confrontation before they understood its shape. "Hannah." He said her name like a diagnosis. "I need to speak with you regarding your schedule." She stopped 6 feet from him. The rain had left small pools between the parking spaces, and one of them reflected the pearl-gray sky like an eye watching them both. She didn't wait. Waiting was surrender. "The trauma rotation," he continued, not waiting for her response. "I've made the decision to reassign you effective immediately. You'll be rotating through post-operative recovery and routine floor work. Dr. Hayes will cover critical cases going forward." The 3 nurses had stopped pretending to walk. They stood near the entrance, their scrub bags held loosely, their full attention on the 2 figures in the parking lot. The fluorescent lights from inside the hospital cast them in profile against the glass doors. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath soldiers take before stepping into ambush. The kind that centers everything, heartbeat, vision, the weight of her own hands. She didn't look away from him. She didn't blink. She did something far more devastating. She waited a full 3 seconds, then spoke as if he were a resident who'd just contaminated a sterile field. "Copy that, doctor." The flatness of it landed like a blade. Not angry. Not emotional. Completely clear. The words weren't agreement. They were acknowledgement of a command given by someone with institutional authority. Dr. Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been expecting pushback, emotion, maybe even the trembling submission of someone being stripped of their purpose. Instead, he'd received the clipped acceptance of a subordinate executing orders. "I'm glad we understand each other," he said, but his voice had lost its smooth certainty. "I trust you'll transition your current cases smoothly." Hannah nodded once and moved past him toward the entrance. The 3 nurses scattered like birds startled from a telephone wire. She could feel him watching her back, expecting her to break stride, to show something, doubt, fear, the small fracture that would confirm his narrative that she was just a nurse who'd overstepped, now recognizing her place. She walked the same pace she always did. The fluorescent doors hissed open. She didn't look back. The post-operative recovery unit occupied the entire 3rd floor, a sprawl of 12 beds separated by heavy curtains, each one monitored by a nurse's station with banks of screens displaying oxygen saturation, heart rhythms, and the steady drip mathematics of pain management. It was technically skilled work, legitimate nursing, exactly what a floor nurse was supposed to do. It was also a systematic erasure. Hannah had worked trauma for 2 years. Now she was being sent to count vital signs and adjust blankets. The first indication that this wasn't accidental came at 7:15 when she tried to access the medication dispensary for a patient needing post-op pain management. The biometric lock didn't recognize her credentials. She tried again. The screen flashed red and generated a printed slip, override required for this user. Sarah Chen, one of the floor's most experienced nurses, had worked beside Hannah for 18 months. She'd helped her intubate a bleeding ulcer patient last spring, and they'd shared coffee at 3 in the morning during a rough shift, talking about nothing, which in hospitals meant talking about everything. Sarah appeared from behind the supply cart like she'd been waiting. "Caldwell changed your access 3 hours ago," Sarah said quietly. "Anyone on post-op recovery needs supervisor override for controlled substances now. Just you. Everyone else is still regular access." The words landed with the weight of understanding. Isolation. Not brutal, not visible enough to be actionable, just bureaucratic suffocation. Hannah nodded and wrote down the patient's request. "I'll page for override." It took 42 minutes for a supervisor to arrive and unlock 3 tablets of hydrocodone that should have taken 3 minutes to dispense. The patient, a woman 3 days post-appendectomy, waited with her pain barely controlled, and the delay wasn't Hannah's fault, but it would read that way in charts, in memory, in the accumulation of small failures. The schedule changes appeared on the unit board at 8 o'clock. The surgical calendar that had once shown Hannah's name on 7 critical cases now showed her name on 0. Dr. Hayes would cover Monday through Friday. Dr. Richmond would cover weekends. Hannah's name appeared on routine post-op rounds and a single trauma observation, a ride-along with no authority, no responsibility, just visibility. A leash. What hurt more, though she wouldn't show it, was the staff reassignments. Marcus Webb, a nurse with 13 years of emergency medicine background, had been transferred to the burn unit effective immediately. Jennifer Torres, the fastest for placer on the floor, was suddenly assigned to urgent care. Kevin Nichols, who had the kind of clinical instinct that made him invaluable in a crisis, was being moved to orthopedics. 3 of her 4 strongest nurses, all reassigned within hours. The new post-op team would be Sarah Chen, loyal, capable, but relatively junior, and 2 recent graduates still in their first year of practice, still checking their own work twice, still moving with the careful deliberation of people afraid of making mistakes. The Green Beret operator was awake when Hannah made her rounds at 2 o'clock. His name was Marcus Holloway, she'd learned from the chart, though the paperwork was light on his background. The intake note simply said, "Transferred from Marja and Special Ops Medical," which in hospital language meant not our jurisdiction. He was mobile now, his shoulder stabilized with aggressive physical therapy, his breathing supported by nothing but his own lungs. He was healing the way young men with military medical training healed, with the assumption that pain was data and recovery was a mission. He was sitting up when she entered the recovery room, the afternoon light coming through the window in solid bars. He watched her approach without the normal patient wariness. Instead, there was something in his eyes that looked like recognition layered beneath recognition, like seeing a person in a photograph and only later understanding the context that made the image matter. "You're being kept away," he said. Not a question. Hannah checked his full line, her movements clinical and precise. The tension in her shoulders was information only she could read. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm still alive because of someone who shouldn't be cleaning bedpans." His voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from having been trained to deliver information under conditions of extreme duress. "I heard them in the hall. The new nurse is asking about dosages. About protocols you used to know better than anyone in this hospital." She didn't respond. She checked his wound dressing, the surgical repair holding well, the inflammation minimal. Everything textbook perfect. Everything exactly as it should be except for the fact that she was here in this moment unable to do anything except verify that someone else's work was intact. "I made a call," he said, and she heard what lay beneath those 4 words. Command structure. Authority that extended far beyond a hospital in Portland. Someone's going to want to talk to you soon. Someone with the actual power to do something about what's happening. Dr. Caldwell passed in the hallway as Hannah was leaving. He stood in the doorway of another recovery room, watching her exit the Green Beret space. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, his narrowing with the recognition that something was moving beneath the surface, something he couldn't see but could sense like pressure changes before a storm. He'd made his calls to board members. He'd begun his investigation. He was expecting documentation, inconsistencies, something to build a case around. What he wasn't expecting was for the problem to have already called for backup. By 4:30, a formal letter had been placed in Hannah's locker. The paper was crisp and official, printed on hospital letterhead with the seal of Oak Creek Memorial in blues and golds at the top. It was 3 paragraphs long. Suspension pending credential review, the header read. Then, due to concerns raised during routine audit regarding professional scope of practice and potential credentialing irregularities, your employment is suspended effective immediately pending thorough investigation. Your access badge has been deactivated. Please return all hospital property to the HR office before departing the premises. The security guard who escorted her to the exit was professional about it, embarrassed actually, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Her locker had already been emptied by someone else, her personal items placed in a cardboard box that smelled like the warehouse where it had been stored. She carried it to her car parked in the far corner of the lot, past the spot where Dr. Caldwell had stood that morning, past the reflecting pools of standing water that held the sky like trapped light. The rain started again as she drove out of the parking lot, soft at first and then harder, hammering against the windshield like applause or accusation. Her phone sat on the passenger seat. No messages. Not yet. But the Green Beret's words echoed in the space between the wiper's rhythm, someone's going to want to talk to you soon. She'd spent 2 years building a life that asked nothing of her except that she be quiet, competent, unforgettable. She'd succeeded completely until the moment a wounded soldier had arrived from Marja and recognized something in her hands that she'd tried to bury. Now that recognition was spreading like blood in water, and everything she'd constructed was collapsing exactly as it had been designed to, and she still had no idea what was about to walk through the next set of doors. The phone call came at 11:19 p.m. Hannah was sitting in her apartment in northeast Portland, staring at the rain against her window, when the unknown number lit up her screen. She almost didn't answer. She'd been suspended as of 4:41 p.m. that afternoon, badge deactivated, credentials under federal review, her entire rebuilt life collapsing with the precision of a controlled demolition. Hannah, it's Dr. Reeves. I'm calling against protocol. The resident's voice was barely a whisper, urgent. Your patient. The Green Beret from Marja. Something's wrong. He crashed during routine vitals 20 minutes ago. Caldwell's in emergency surgery on the 3rd floor, won't be available for at least 30 minutes. The attending on call is 45 minutes out. We're losing him, and I don't know what to do. Hannah was already moving. She didn't remember grabbing her keys, didn't remember the drive through Portland's rain-slicked streets at speeds that blurred the traffic lights into watercolor smears. What she remembered was the loading dock entrance on the east side of Oak Creek Memorial, the one security had ignored for 3 years because she'd never given them reason to watch it. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, hood up, face down, muscle memory carrying her toward the ICU while her mind screamed at her to turn around, to protect what little remained. The operator was gasping when she reached him. His name was Marcus Holloway, and he was drowning on dry land. His trachea was deviated, pushed to the left like a twisted rope. His jugular veins were distended, swollen hard against his neck. The ventilator was pushing air into lungs that couldn't accept it. He was circling the drain, and the residents surrounding him were frozen in the particular paralysis of medical training meeting real crisis without authority. Tension pneumothorax, Hannah said. Not a question. The room's fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as 5 residents turned toward her simultaneously, recognition and confusion flickering across their faces. You're suspended, one of them said, but it wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. Hannah was already at the crash cart, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of muscle memory that had learned its lessons in Kandahar and Marja, in FOB shank and landing zones under fire. She grabbed the trauma shears. Stainless steel, heavy, familiar. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said, her voice dropping an octave. Not a request. A command. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in rooms where hesitation meant death. She cut away Marcus's gown. Found the landmarks with her fingertips, the second rib, the space beneath it, the precise anatomy that separates life from a body that just stops working. The rain outside hammered against the ICU windows like applause for what she was about to do. "Hand me the largest needle in this cart," she told Dr. Reeves. 18 gauge if you have it. His hand shook as he passed it to her. She didn't hesitate. She'd done this in a medical tent with a hypodermic needle and a prayer. She'd done this with equipment meant for animals because that's what field medicine was, improvisation in the space between impossible and necessary. She positioned the needle perpendicular to his chest wall, felt the resistance of skin and muscle, and then the hiss of air escaping. The room's pressure changing like a door opening into somewhere else. "There," she said quietly. "You're watching because next time you'll be alone. Next time you might be in a desert with no backup, or in a warehouse, or standing over someone who matters. You'll remember this moment and you'll move, because hesitation is a choice to let them die." Marcus's oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, the mechanical sound of his breathing shifted, became less desperate. The monitor's alarms quieted from screaming to steady beeping. One of the residents started to cry, whether from relief or fear or the recognition that they'd just watched someone do the impossible, Hannah couldn't tell. When the supplies didn't arrive, because in chaos, supplies never arrive fast enough, Hannah pulled the plastic wrapper from Marcus's meal tray. The one they'd brought him hours ago when he was stable, when the world still made sense. She'd used the same improvisation in Marja, fashioning a chest seal from the waterproof packaging of field rations while rounds snapped overhead and the air smelled like copper and dust and the particular heat of blood hitting hot metal. She sealed the needle site with the wrapper, securing it in a way that would hold pressure while allowing air to escape if the pneumothorax returned. Medical field craft. Combat medicine. The kind of knowledge that you didn't list on a resume because it implied things no hospital wanted to acknowledge they employed. Marcus stabilized. His color improved. His breathing became something that resembled normal, the rhythm of a body deciding to keep living. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the ICU corridor 17 seconds later. Dr. Caldwell emerged in full surgical regalia, mask still around his neck, scrub cap still covering his hair, blood on his sleeve in a pattern that suggested he'd been scrubbing for hours. Behind him was a security officer, the type of man who'd learned institutional authority and wore it like a uniform that never quite fit. And behind them, moving with the deliberate precision of predators who'd learned their craft in places that didn't appear on maps, were two figures in dark suits that read federal the way certain fabrics only ever read money. Caldwell's face cycled through emotions like a corrupted film reel. Recognition. Shock. Fury. Calculation. He assessed the scene in 2.3 seconds, the suspended resident at the bedside, the plastic wrapper seal, the elevated oxygen saturation on the monitor, the clinical reality that Hannah had just saved the life of the patient who'd blown open her carefully constructed anonymity. "She's trespassing," Caldwell announced to the assembled staff, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "Call the police. And someone document everything. She just performed an invasive medical procedure without credentials, without authorization, and without an active medical license. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's a felony." The security officer moved toward Hannah with the apologetic expression of a man simply executing his institutional role. She didn't resist. Resistance would only compound the damage. She handed him her identification, the badge that had been deactivated at 4:06 p.m., the metal still warm from being in her pocket. The two federal agents didn't move. They simply watched her with the particular focus of people whose job was to understand which threads in a tapestry would unravel the entire fabric when pulled. Caldwell was already on his phone before the elevator doors closed behind her. She heard him from the corridor, "I need legal. We're filing formal termination papers and criminal complaints. Dr. Clarke performed an authorized surgery on a patient in my hospital without licensure. I want documentation, I want witness statements, and I want this reported to the state medical board within the hour." Hannah drove through Portland's rain-soaked streets without seeing them. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her breathing was controlled. The trembling, when it came, was not fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from understanding exactly how close she'd come to destroying everything, and how completely she'd failed. By 9:27 p.m., she was standing at Oak Hill Cemetery, the rain falling hard enough to erase the city behind her. Row after row of headstones, each one a person who'd tried to be normal and failed in ways large and small, who'd tried to leave their past behind and discovered that the past is not something you leave, but something you carry until it grows too heavy. David Clarke's grave was toward the back, beneath a Douglas fir that had grown 50 years' worth of rings since he'd been buried. Her husband. The man who'd held her through the night terrors, who'd asked her to leave the military, to be safe, to be the mother their son needed instead of the soldier the army made. She'd promised him. She'd tried. The faded unit patch came out of the jacket lining where she'd kept it for 2 years, a piece of her past small enough to hide, large enough to haunt. It was from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the unit she'd served with in Kandahar when she was someone else entirely. Before she was Hannah Clarke the nurse. Before she was anyone's mother. "I tried to leave it behind like you wanted," she whispered to the rain and the stone and the memory of a man who'd loved her too much to understand that some people are born for one thing and pretending otherwise is a kind of death. "I tried to just be normal. To be safe. To be the mom our son needed instead of the person who can't turn off the part of her brain that sees patients as casualties waiting to be processed." Her hands were trembling now. The kind of trembling that comes from holding a secret for so long that it calcifies into something that poisons everything it touches. The patch was old, worn soft from being handled. It carried the weight of 20 years. "I failed," she said. "I couldn't just watch him die. I couldn't let the residents freeze while a good man bled out in front of them. And now I've lost everything again. My job. My credentials. My son might understand or he might hate me for choosing to be who I am instead of who I promised to be. And I do it exactly the same way, which means I never actually changed at all." She knelt in the mud beside the headstone, the rain soaking through her jacket, the unit patch clasped in both hands like something sacred. The cemetery around her was empty except for the sound of water falling from a sky that had no mercy and no judgment, only the simple physics of weather moving across a landscape that endured everything and forgot nothing. The gate at the cemetery's entrance was only 50 yards away, but it felt like an ocean. Behind her was the life she'd built. Ahead was whatever came next, which was nothing, suspension, investigation, the systematic dismantling of everything she'd reconstructed from ash and intention. 3 days later, in a conference room on the 15th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, the hospital board would convene for her termination hearing. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know that someone had already activated chains of command that stretched beyond civilian medicine, beyond Portland, into the high corridors where government keeps the names of people it has trained to do impossible things in impossible places. She didn't know that her son was already printing documentation he'd found in his father's things, the shadow box in the attic that she believed was safely forgotten. She didn't know that Marcus Holloway, the Green Beret who'd recognized her in delirium, had been on the phone with his unit's leadership, explaining what had happened in the ICU, the implications of what he'd witnessed. Right now, she only knew the rain and the grave and the weight of 20 years that couldn't be buried, only endured. And somewhere in the city, moving with the precision of institutional machinery that had learned long ago how to protect its assets, the machinery was already turning. The machinery always turns, in the end. It just takes time. The boardroom at Oak Creek Memorial fell silent the moment the doors opened. Hannah Clarke sat in a metal chair facing 12 hospital board members arranged behind a curved mahogany table, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced sympathy, the kind reserved for terminations. Dr. Caldwell stood to her right, a leather folder clutched against his chest like a shield, his expression radiating the cold certainty of a man about to dismantle a career. The board president opened his mouth to speak. He never got the words out. The rear doors burst open hard enough to rattle the glass panels. Hannah's teenage son, Tyler, stood in the doorway breathing like he'd run through every corridor in the building. In his trembling hands, he held a shadow box. The kind that belonged in a museum or a bedroom wall, the kind that held something sacred. His eyes found his mother across the room. "Mom, they need to see these," Tyler said, his voice cracking on each word. "You don't get to hide anymore." He walked to the table, placed the shadow box down in front of the board president, stepped back beside his mother and took her hand. The silence was absolute. The kind of silence that exists in trauma bays when a patient flatlines and everyone holds their breath waiting for the defibrillator to charge. The board president slowly opened the shadow box. His face changed. The sympathy evaporated. Behind him, the other board members rose without being asked, stretching forward to see. Their mouths opened. Closed. Someone exhaled audibly. That was when the wheelchair rolled forward. Marcus Holloway, the Green Beret operator Hannah had saved from catastrophic bleeding 72 hours earlier, rolled himself to the center of the room. His left leg ended at the knee, a sacrifice made in Helmand Province for years ago. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Dr. Caldwell with the kind of gaze that comes from standing on the edge of oblivion and refusing to blink. "That's Major Hannah Clarke," Marcus said. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent his life around command authority. It wasn't a statement. It was a declaration. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The board president's hands moved to the shadow box. He lifted the first decoration with the reverence of a man holding something he suddenly understood he'd never deserved to touch. A nurse Hannah had worked with for 2 years, Janet, the trembling one who'd started in trauma rotation just 4 months ago, stood from the back of the room with a folder, her hand shaking as she opened it. "2 silver stars," Janet whispered, reading from the declassified military record that had been couriered over by courier from the Pentagon's personnel office. The words were barely audible, but everyone heard them. The board members exchanged glances like they were reassembling a puzzle they'd thought they understood. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. Each decoration she named was lifted from the shadow box and placed on the table like evidence. Like proof. Like the things Hannah had never wanted anyone to see or know or ask about. The rear doors opened again. A man in his early 60s walked in, straight posture, navy dress blues with 3 gold stars on his shoulders, the kind of authority that came from spending 30 years commanding men in situations where seconds determined whether people lived or died. Beside him walked another operator, younger, still moving with the liquid precision of someone who'd trained at Dam Neck with SEAL Team 3. "I'm Master Chief Petty Officer James Mercer, Navy SEAL Team 3, retired," the SEAL said, stepping forward with measured strides. His uniform carried more ribbons than most people in the room had achievements. "I flew in last night because when Major Clarke saved Marcus Holloway's life in Marja in 2004, she didn't save him for recognitions or certificates. She saved him because that's what warriors do. They serve. They sacrifice. They act when others freeze." Mercer looked at each board member individually, a technique that took exactly 11 seconds and felt like an interrogation. 2 silver stars come from operations in Kandahar and Sanjin Valley where Major Clarke coordinated medical evacuation for 47 injured combatants under active fire. The Bronze Star with Valor comes from a day in Marja where she performed emergency triage for 93 civilians caught in a structural collapse, including a 7-year-old boy she pulled from concrete rubble with her own hands. That boy, Marcus Holloway, now commands a tactical element of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The Purple Heart comes from an IED blast that should have killed her. It took 8 surgeons and 6 units of blood. She lived because she's the kind of person that doesn't have the quit in her. Mercer stepped back. The silence lasted long enough for the fluorescent lights overhead to buzz twice, an almost audible reminder that the natural world kept turning even as institutional hierarchies crumbled. "Your investigation of Major Clarke triggered a federal review, Dr. Caldwell," a new voice said from the doorway. This man wore a navy suit and carried credentials that made the board president sit down immediately. "FBI." He opened a folder with the careful precision of someone who'd prepared this speech dozens of times. "Our inquiry into Dr. Caldwell's conduct uncovered a pattern spanning 7 years. Altered patient records to hide surgical complications, 23 documented instances where postoperative infections, wrong site surgeries, and retained surgical instruments were recorded by nursing staff and subsequently deleted from official medical files. Caldwell's hand went to his tie. He loosened it slightly. His breathing had changed. The FBI liaison continued, his voice mechanical and devoid of emotion. Additionally, evidence of pharmaceutical sample diversion. You sold prescription medications intended for patient assistance programs, medications given to uninsured patients. We recovered transaction records totaling $187,000 in unreported income over a 4-year period. He turned the page. Finally, kickback arrangements with 3 medical device companies. Specifically, Esculapius Medical, Sterling Orthopedics, and Precision Surgical Solutions. You received preferential pricing on devices you mandated for every procedure, regardless of patient need, and accepted payments totaling $414,000 in unreported income. The board president's face had transformed. It was the expression of a man realizing the structure he'd built his reputation on contained dry rot in every wooden beam. You used your institutional authority to investigate Major Clarke's credentials while systematically defrauding this hospital and endangering patients, the board president said, standing. His voice had dropped to something colder and sharper. Security. Escort Dr. Caldwell from the premises. The FBI will be filing formal charges. 2 security officers appeared like they'd been waiting just outside. Caldwell reached for his folder. One officer took it from him. He moved toward the door with the mechanical shuffle of someone whose body had abandoned him. As he passed Hannah's chair, he didn't look at her. He looked at the floor. Looked at the space between his shoes and the polished tile beneath him. Marcus Holloway's wheelchair rolled forward. He positioned himself directly in Caldwell's path, forcing the doctor to stop. You went after her because she threatened your little kingdom, Marcus said quietly. Because when a real leader enters a room, frauds like you get exposed just by proximity. You felt it the moment she touched that patient. You felt your irrelevance. And you couldn't stand it. Caldwell didn't respond. The security officers escorted him out. His footsteps echoed down the hallway with a diminishing quality, like sound retreating from the world. The board president turned to Hannah. She stood slowly, Tyler still holding her hand. The entire board rose as well, a gesture that happened without conscious decision, like their bodies understood something before their minds caught up. Major Clarke, we owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express, the board president began. His voice had become something different. Smaller. More human. We failed to see who you were. We allowed institutional bias, Anne. Hannah raised her hand slightly. I didn't save that boy in the ICU for recognition, she said. Her voice was steady but carried no anger, just a statement of fact. I saved him because it was right. That's all I've ever done. Mercer stepped forward. The military would welcome you back, Major. Medical Command has positions in the Pentagon. Personnel recovery coordination. Training oversight. Your clearance is still active. Hannah shook her head gently. My fighting days are over, Master Chief. But maybe I can still serve. The board president extended his hand. We want to establish something new. A position. Director of Combat Veteran Integration Program. Veterans come home broken and need guidance through the medical system. We need someone who understands that wound. We need you. Hannah looked at the position like she was seeing it for the first time. Like the future had suddenly shifted beneath her feet and settled into something she could stand on. 6 months later, a nameplate was mounted on an office door at Oak Creek Memorial, Major Hannah Clarke, Director of Combat Veteran Integration Program. The office walls displayed a faded unit patch in a mahogany frame, with a note beneath it in her son's handwriting, because some people are born to serve, and the uniform doesn't make them, they make the uniform. Hannah stood at her desk reviewing trauma protocols when the emergency alert chimed. Medical transport inbound. Critical patient. Military assignment. The the call identical to the one that had changed everything. She moved with quiet confidence through the corridors, past colleagues who now understood exactly who they worked beside. Her limp was barely noticeable now. Her hands were steady. As she entered the trauma bay, she touched the place on her jacket where the unit patch used to be sewn, now displayed proudly in her office, and squared her shoulders. Tyler watched from the observation deck above, a pre-med student now, his face carrying something beyond pride. He was watching his mother do what she was born to do. The trauma team parted. Hannah stepped to the patient's head and took command. "Let's get to work," she said quietly. And every person in that room moved like they understood they were working for someone who'd already survived the impossible and chose to show up anyway. Did you know that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding it all together? If this story resonated with you, subscribe to see more tales of hidden strength and quiet warriors walking among us. Like this video if Hannah's journey moved you, and comment below, have you ever been completely misjudged by someone in power? We'd love to hear your story.